guys? This is Yoda. This will be my last tier list update for War Within Beta Mythic Plus. It's been quite the journey up till now. And yesterday, there were some massive raid buff changes. So they nerfed Arcane Intellect and they nerfed Chaos Brand from 5 to 3%. First, we'll address that. The biggest change, in my opinion, is the Chaos Brand change because it makes Demon Hunter have a worse raid buff than Druids because 3% burst is worth more than 3% magic damage. So in my opinion, that pushes Guardian up to be better than VDH. The Arcane Intellect change, in my opinion, doesn't do too much because Mage didn't really have competition. Arcane Intellect is still the best raid buff from a ranged DPS that you can get. It's also impossible to get Arcane Intellect from another role, whereas like with Sky Fury and Mark of the Wild, you can get it from your healer from Sky Fury, and you can get Mark of the Wild from your tank. So we'll start at the top. Meta for sure. Mage, I don't believe like the melee comp, quote unquote, copium. I'm pretty sure you're still gonna want to play and Mage. There is a chance the third DPS might be a melee, but I think you're gonna still want and Mage, just because they buff the healer so much. 3% is still 3%. The healers are gonna take everything they can get to survive this season. I left both the other two mages down here because depending on tuning, I'm not sure which mage you'll actually play. Right now it's Arcane, but you know, surely Arcane gets hit with the nerf bat on Heroic Week. No one knows how strong that'll be or what counter buffs they'll give to the other mage specs, but you'll definitely play a mage because 95%, one of them will be tuned pretty good, and they'll have Arcane Intellect plus all of the other things that mages bring. So I think and Mage are definitely in the meta for sure. Next we'll go into maybe meta. I believe Bear is overtaking VDH now for like the quote-unquote meta choice tank. I think Bear is probably like more stable of a tank than VDH. It has better self-healing. It's just a little bit weaker against bosses, but if you like are playing with the same group over and over again, you'll be able to figure it out. And as we mentioned earlier, Mark of the Wild I think is better than Chaos Brand now. As far as healers go, H-Pal has gotten nerfed enough that I think Resto Shaman is probably the best healer at this point. Provides 20% max HP, definitely not to be ignored. It's like an insane amount of max health. And it also just has really good healing throughput. Like the other healers all have, you know, either Presvoker has like high throughput, but it doesn't have the raid buff. It doesn't have the 20% max health. Holy Paladin has decent throughput, but no, not worse raid buff. Resto Druid has a raid buff, but not as much healing. So I think Resto Shaman has the best mix of everything. So I would put them as, in my opinion, the best healer. I only put it in maybe meta instead of like meta for sure because things can change, tuning can change, you never know. All right, now for the juicy part. Because actually of the Arcane Intellect and Chaos Brand nerfs, I think some of these melee are actually viable for meta. In fact, I would say if the game were to release tomorrow, or Mythic Plus was out tomorrow, I would play these 5. Mage, Guardian, Resto Druid, or Resto Shaman, and DK as my quote-unquote top 5 class meta comp. The reason for this is that, you know, obviously these casters have been nerfed by 2-ish% from Arcane Intellect and some more from having Bear instead of Chaos Brand comparatively to the other specs. For instance, like even though Frost DK has mostly magic damage, it does some physical damage. So like the Mark of the Wild is better for them than Chaos Brand. Anyway, I think it's perfectly viable to play at least like one melee now. In the meta comp, I would say Frost Decay is probably my preferred among them just because it's so immune to damage that it's like so tanky that you can even immune some boss mechanics. Like for instance, Skarmorak, which is a boss in the Stone Vault, is like infinitely easier if you have a Frost Decay in your group. They just eat all like eight ball stacks and then just solo the shield. Not really any DPS that can do that other than them. And grips are just super useful, plus AMS for soaking on some bosses is very useful. So I would put Blood Decay as a better choice. Frost Decay is a better choice. Assassination Rogue does do, I think, the most damage of all the melees, so if you just want to look good on details, Assassination Rogue is probably a good choice. You can also flame your tank for not giving you restells. I know a lot of DPS love doing that, so we're going to do that. Put that up there. Enhancement Shaman does really, really good priority damage. Note that if you have a Resto Shaman, you're losing out on by having like double Shaman for the raid buff, but I think Enhancement Shaman's damage profile is so good that maybe you would consider it in a quote-unquote maybe meta group. It just does so much funnel priority damage. It's insane, so I'm having it up here. Also, Shaman utility is really good even without the buff. Just like 12-second kick, low cooldown knockup, AoE stun, blah, blah, all that. Curse Dispel also randomly super useful. So yeah, Shaman I think is in a really good spot. Unholy DK I just have here because I think if you play DPS DK, you should probably be able to play both. Unholy DK has better uncapped AoE than Frost, but I think it has less damage in like smaller pulls or on single target. Maybe that'll change, you know, after some tuning, but yeah, I have DK DPS rated pretty high. For casters, Aflock and Ellie Shaman have been looking really good. damage-wise. We'll see if that holds up in Heroic Week. I kind of moved Shadow Priest and Moonkin a bit down because, you know, after many attempts, people seem to not be doing that much damage, either missing out AoE or missing single target from these, so I moved them down one tier. Next, we'll go over the strong category. So BDH, as we mentioned, I think has been dethroned as the best tank. I think it still does probably the highest personal damage, but I would rather have a bear now because Mark of the Wild is so hard to get, and it's just a better raid buff. And it seems, I think bear is a bit more stable of a tank too. Blood Decay we also have in this tier because I think Blood Decay is probably the most self-sufficient tank when played well, and also pretty sturdy when played well. But it does not have very high personal DPS, and it also doesn't bring a raid buff to the table. In my opinion, it's probably the best pug tank, so we have a pug tier list we'll go over after this, which I freshly made yesterday. We also got Warrior in this tier. I saw some Warrior rated as the #1 tank for pushing. I think that is honestly copium. Warrior self-healing is not really that good, so being too reliant on your healer I think is too much of a detriment, so I wouldn't put Warrior in the maybe medic category. Also, Mark of the Wild is just better than Battle Shout, so there's that too. Healers we kind of went over already. These all are like kind of close to Resto Shaman, but they're just missing something. Like Prez Evoker has the same heal, like probably better honestly, healing and damage, but it's missing raid buff, missing max health buff. HPAL has, you know, probably this rough, pretty close in terms of like keeping your group alive. It has really good healing throughput. It has some pretty good defensive buffs like the beacons, 5% DR, AM, whatever. It's pretty good at keeping your group alive, but it's missing the raid buff that Shaman has. Druid is kind of the opposite problem. It has a good buff, it has good damage, but the healing is not as good as Shaman. And the damage isn't like that ridiculous anymore now that it's been nerfed. Also in the strong category, we've got a bunch of melee that are like kind of okay. Before I had survival lower and sub lower, but now that like the really good melee are in the maybe meta category, I feel like it's okay to move these up. Shadow Priest and Demo also in this tier. I think if Af gets nerfed, then Demo's probably gonna be the better warlock to play, but you know, we'll see. Though I don't really play casters that much myself, so keep that in mind. Mid category, we've got Brew and Prot Pally. Brew, I think, has kind of fallen off in my eyes. Like nothing actually happened to the spec, but after playing it more, it feels like you just require a lot more healing than the tanks above it. And in return, you're not bringing that much to the table. Like if you can just survive the keys, but you need to be healed, but then you also don't have a good raid buff, you also don't have grips, you know, you also don't have whatever Paladin has for utility, then it's adding up to be like not that great in my opinion. It's still definitely playable. You can still definitely do the keys. It's just going to be harder because you need more healing. I also put Paladin in the mid tier. I actually managed to chest some keys pretty recently on Paladin. I feel like if you play crit wings, at least your damage is kind of okay. If you have to play Sentinel, then your damage is really, really bad. There still has the same problems, like you still go sometimes, just healing yourself, which is really annoying. It's still like kind of squishy, especially if you make mistakes, you're probably going to die on Paladin. So yeah, I have it in the mid category. I definitely think it's the worst tank right now. Needs a lot of help because it's too squishy. But it's not like so horrible that it's like unplayable, I think. Next we'll go over the rest of Disc Priest. I did play with Disc Priest recently. One of the main things I noticed that was missing is like all of these healers actually have a kick. Shaman, Prez, HPAL, Shaman, and Druid all have a kick. And they all have decent like utility / AoE stops. Disc Priest doesn't really have that. In terms of healing, I think it's kind of able to keep up with healing. It's just like it's unable to prevent disasters from happening in your group from like interrupts or stops. And I think it's actually kind of important for the healer to contribute to that in higher keys. So I have a Disc in the mid category. The other hunters I feel like are just not as good as other ranged. They don't benefit from Arcane Intellect, and damage is not quite there. So we have them in this category. Arms I haven't seen too much of. Outlaw I think is actually kind of good in a vacuum right now. The problem is that the dungeon pool just doesn't suit Outlaw that well, and you lost Acrobatic Strikes. So like for instance, in Necrotic Wake, like the first pull just has like 30 mobs and it lasts 30 seconds. So like not only are you target capped, you also have ramp time. Outlaw is just in complete shambles in that pull. Then in like for instance the Dawnbreaker, if you're trying to keep your AR from stealth by underhand and upper hand, well, too bad. You're mounting between every pack, so unlucky. So I feel like Outlaw is actually okay in a vacuum. It just doesn't really fit the dungeon pool that well. Some dungeons it'll be fine, and other dungeons it'll be terrible. Ret, honestly, I just haven't seen, like a lot of these I just haven't seen people play that much. So they could easily be like up here, but I haven't seen anyone perform that well on them, and I haven't seen that many people play them in general, so I have them in the mid tier. Windwalker I have seen quite a bit of, and I think it's probably not as good as the rest of these DPS. Honestly, it could probably be like end of strong tier or high mid, but not too concerned about exactly where it is. Windwalker is like playable, but not super strong. That's where I would put it. Dester Warlock's here. I honestly haven't seen anyone spec Dester Warlock after like day one of getting nerfed. So I have a feeling it's just not very good. Moonkin I have seen quite a bit of. The AoE is actually super strong. It does really, really good AoE. It keeps up with all the other specs, and it does the Mark of the Wild. The main problem is that it just doesn't really do single target. It's like kind of like 10 to 20% behind on every boss, which is very important for Mythic Plus. So if that gets buffed, then Moonkin could very, very easily like be all the way up here. The main problem right now is that it just doesn't really do single target, so it's not good. Holy Priest and Mistweaver. I saw like one Mistweaver key, but I haven't really seen anyone play since then, so I'm just going to leave these in the unknown category. Haven't seen anyone play them. Need buffs. We've got the Devastation Evoker. I believe Devastation Evoker unfortunately caught splash damage when they nerfed Scale Commander for AUG, and it just hasn't been rebuffed. Surely Blizzard is going to do something about that, surely. But yeah. Alright, so this is the final meta tier list for War Within Beta Mythic Plus. Next, I did have some requests for a pug-friendly tier list, so we'll go over that.